He saw the rusted metal glinting in the pale, disturbed light of the Gulf of Mexico. It was a fragment of a world that had vanished, a relic from a time when two lives still held the promise of an open sea and a future without end. It was 2007, and divers were exploring the wreckage of a sailboat just off the coast of Florida. They were not looking for a lost dream, but for a piece of a nightmare. The diver, a man named Mike, recognized the shape instantly. It was the housing for a satellite phone antenna, a piece of equipment that on a good day could summon help from anywhere on the planet. But on a very bad day, it could be the last thing a person ever saw. 6 years earlier, in June of 2001, a wealthy couple named Patrick and Virginia Murphy had set sail from the Florida Keys. They were seasoned sailors, experienced and prepared, with a deep love for the open water. Their journey was meant to be a simple, pleasant trip through the azure waters of the Gulf, a private escape from the pressures of their successful lives. They owned a prosperous business, and their retirement was set to be a long, peaceful glide into the sunset. They were known for their generosity and their quiet confidence, a couple who had built a life on a foundation of hard work and mutual respect. Their vessel, the Sea Witch, was a sleek 40-foot catamaran, a vessel designed for speed, comfort, and safety. Its navigation systems were state-of-the-art, its safety equipment meticulously maintained. The satellite phone was one of its most critical pieces of gear, a direct line to the outside world should anything go wrong. For days, the trip unfolded as planned. The sun-drenched horizons, the gentle sway of the boat, the rhythmic sound of the waves against the hull, it was all a symphony of serenity. But the music stopped. The regular check-ins with their family ceased. Days turned into weeks, and the initial concern morphed into a frantic, gut-wrenching dread. The United States Coast Guard launched a massive search operation. From the air, the expanse of the Gulf seemed infinite. Helicopters and planes crisscrossed the vast blue, their crews scanning the surface for any sign of the Sea Witch or its occupants. The Murphys' families, helpless on shore, were a mix of hope and despair. They clung to the fact that Patrick and Virginia were experienced. They knew how to handle a crisis. Perhaps they were simply out of range, their radio damaged, their satellite phone offline. But a seasoned sailor knows the silence of the sea can be deceptive. It can be a veil for 100 different tragedies. A storm could have appeared from nowhere. A rogue wave could have capsized the catamaran. The silence of the Gulf was not the quiet of a peaceful nap. It was the hush of an unforgiving wilderness. The search lasted for weeks, becoming one of the most extensive maritime search operations in recent history. The Coast Guard's resources were stretched to their limit, but they found nothing. Not a life raft, not a piece of debris, not a single trace of the Sea Witch. It was as if the 40-foot catamaran and its 2 occupants had been swallowed whole by the ocean. As the weeks turned into months, the search was called off. The Coast Guard concluded the couple was lost at sea, their disappearance a tragic but unexplainable accident. The Murphys were declared legally dead, and their families were left to mourn a loss without a body, a grave without a coffin. The mystery of the Sea Witch became a local legend, a ghost story told in Florida marinas about the dangers of the open water, a cautionary tale about a perfect life that vanished without a whisper. But the story was far from over. The sea in its vast and silent depths, held a secret. It was a secret that would remain buried for 6 long years, a dark truth waiting for a diver to stumble upon a rusted piece of metal that was once a lifeline. And in that moment, the seemingly tragic story of a couple lost at sea would begin to unravel, revealing a far more sinister plot lurking beneath the waves. The discovery of the antenna would not bring the Murphys back, but it would tear down the wall of assumptions that had surrounded their disappearance for so long, and it would expose a shocking reality that no one could have ever predicted. The serene waters of the Gulf had not swallowed the Murphys. They had merely hidden the evidence of their murder. And the first piece of that evidence, the first hint of what truly happened, lay in the palm of a diver's hand. It was the first echo of a crime that had been silent for 6 years, and it would lead investigators down a path of betrayal, greed, and a cold-blooded murder plot that was meticulously planned and executed with chilling precision. The peaceful sea had a darker story to tell, and it was finally beginning to speak. The emotional weight on the families was immense. They had lived for years with the ambiguous grief of a disappearance. They had imagined their loved ones' last moments countless times, picturing them fighting the waves or simply succumbing to the elements in a vast, lonely expanse. The thought of a sudden natural tragedy was a terrible comfort, a way to process the incomprehensible loss. But now, with a single rusted piece of equipment, that comfort was gone. It was replaced with a new, even more terrifying question. Were the Murphys victims of a crime? The initial reports of the discovery were met with skepticism. 6 years was a long time. The sea could do many things to a boat and its equipment. The Coast Guard had concluded it was a natural accident. But the diver's instinct, the way the antenna was found, suggested something else. The piece of metal was not just floating on the surface, it was attached to something buried in the sand, as if it had been a part of a much larger structure that had been deliberately sunk. The investigation, which had been dormant for half a decade, was suddenly reopened. The rusted piece of antenna was sent to a forensic lab. Every detail was scrutinized. The type of metal, the way it was broken, the marine life that had encrusted it, each element was a clue. The labs confirmed that the antenna belonged to a vessel of the Sea Witch's class. It was a small but undeniable link to the missing catamaran. The discovery was more than just a piece of a boat. It was a promise that the ocean would finally give up its secrets. For the Murphys' families, the news was a fresh wave of pain. The healing process, which had been slow and difficult, was shattered. They were no longer mourning a loss at sea. They were grappling with the terrifying possibility of murder. The emotional stakes were now sky high. The uncertainty had returned, but it was a more menacing, predatory kind of uncertainty. The investigation shifted from a search and rescue to a criminal inquiry. The Coast Guard and local law enforcement joined forces, now operating under the assumption that they were looking for a crime scene, not a natural disaster site. The discovery of the antenna was the hook, the first glimmer of a truth that was darker than any storm. The vast, empty expanse of the sea had finally offered up its first whisper, and it was a name: murder. The stage was set for a new kind of drama, a story of forensic detectives and investigators piecing together a puzzle from the fragments of a shipwreck, all while a killer, long dormant, watched from the shadows. The ocean had kept its secret for 6 years, but it was now ready to reveal all. The discovery of the satellite phone antenna was a small pinprick in the vast darkness of the mystery, but it was enough to let the light in. With the reopening of the case, the investigative lens was no longer focused on the open water, but on the Murphys' lives and relationships on land. The police, working backward, began to re-examine every detail of their last days. They scrutinized their financial records, their business dealings, and most importantly, the people they were closest to. The initial investigation had been a simple, straightforward search for a missing vessel. The new investigation was a deep dive into the human heart, into the dark corners of greed, betrayal, and motive. The first logical step was to look at who stood to gain from the Murphys' death. Patrick and Virginia were not just wealthy, they were millionaires with a thriving business and significant assets. The beneficiary of their wills was a clear, primary person of interest, Patrick's brother, Donald Murphy. Donald had always been a figure in the Murphys' lives, but his relationship with Patrick was complex. They were business partners in name, but Patrick was the driving force behind their success. Donald, by all accounts, was more of a passive participant, a man who lived in the shadow of his more successful and charismatic brother. He was a quiet, unassuming man, not someone who seemed capable of cold-blooded murder. But investigators know that appearances can be deceiving. They began to build a profile of Donald. He had been a steady presence in the family's life, a loving uncle to Patrick and Virginia's children, and a seemingly supportive brother. But beneath the surface, there were signs of strain. Patrick, in his desire to protect his family's future, had insisted that a new will be drawn up. This new document, which was in the process of being finalized just before the couple set sail, would have significantly reduced Donald's inheritance. It was a detail that had been overlooked in the frantic days of the initial search. But now, with the chilling possibility of a crime, it took on a whole new meaning. It was a motive, cold and clinical, but a motive nonetheless. The new line of inquiry was a delicate and painful process. The investigators knew they were asking the Murphys' families to relive their grief and suspicion. They had to be careful, respectful, and meticulous. They spoke to friends, neighbors, and business associates. The picture they began to paint was not of a perfect family, but a family with flaws and tensions, just like any other. They learned about the quiet resentments, the unspoken jealousies that simmered beneath the surface of the Murphy brothers' relationship. The financial documents were a key piece of the puzzle. They showed a pattern of careful asset management by Patrick and a dependence on his financial guidance by Donald. The new will, which had been drafted but not yet signed, was the final piece of the puzzle. It was a line drawn in the sand, a clear signal that Patrick was moving to secure his legacy and, in the process, diminish his brother's role. It was a shift in power, a change in the family dynamic that had the potential to ignite a simmering conflict. The investigators' focus on Donald intensified. They began to look at his actions in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. He had been in frequent contact with Patrick and Virginia, discussing the final preparations for their trip. He had even been present on the day they set sail, waving goodbye from the dock, a seemingly innocent act of brotherly affection. But in the cold light of a murder investigation, every action, no matter how small, becomes a potential clue. Was that goodbye a final farewell, a silent victory lap? Or was it the genuine emotion of a man unaware of the tragedy to come? The ambiguity was a thick, suffocating fog, and the investigators had to cut through it with hard facts. They requested a deeper forensic analysis of the discovered antenna. They wanted to know not just that it was from the sea witch, but how it had been detached. The experts returned with a startling finding. The antenna housing had not been broken off by the force of a storm or the impact of a shipwreck. It had been cleanly severed, a deliberate cut made by a tool. This finding was a game changer. It eliminated the possibility of a natural disaster and cemented the theory of foul play. The sea witch had not been lost at sea. It had been scuttled, its remains deliberately sunk to hide a crime. The new information was a shock to the Murphys' families. The idea that their loved ones had been murdered was a terrible and traumatic realization. The ambiguity of lost at sea was a kind of protection, a way to hold on to the last flicker of hope. But the word murder was a brutal, final stamp on their grief. It transformed their mourning from a quiet, internal process to a public, legal battle for justice. The emotional weight on the investigators was also immense. They were no longer just solving a puzzle. They were seeking justice for two people whose lives had been violently and senselessly taken. The pressure was on to find more evidence, to build a case that would stand up in court. The antenna was a powerful piece of circumstantial evidence, but it was not enough to get a conviction. They needed to find the bodies, or at the very least, a smoking gun. The investigation was now a race against time, a race to uncover the rest of the secrets that the Gulf of Mexico held. The story of the Murphys had shifted from a tragic mystery to a chilling true crime story. It was a narrative of betrayal, of a family torn apart, not by the forces of nature, but by the poison of greed. The discovery of that one rusted piece of metal had done more than reopen a case. It had ripped open a wound and revealed a rot that had been festering for years. The quiet man on the dock, the loving brother, was now the prime suspect in a doubly homicide. And the ocean, which had silently held its secret for so long, was now ready to give up the rest of its dark, disturbing story. The investigators were on the cusp of a major breakthrough, a discovery that would not only bring them closer to the truth, but also reveal the horrific details of the couple's final moments. The silence of the sea was finally giving way to a confession. The revelation that the satellite phone antenna had been deliberately severed from the vessel sent shock waves through the quiet, reopened investigation. The possibility of a storm or an unforeseen accident was now officially off the table. The Murphys had been the victims of foul play, and the search for their remains was no longer about closure, but about finding the final irrefutable evidence of a crime. The investigators, now with the support of the Coast Guard's specialized search teams, shifted their focus from a broad, general search to a meticulous, forensic-level examination of the area where the antenna was found. The ocean floor, a place of silent beauty and forgotten things, was now a potential crime scene. The search team, using advanced sonar and submersible drones, began to map the seabed in a grid pattern. The goal was simple but daunting. Find the rest of the sea witch. The area was vast, and the currents had a way of scattering debris over a wide expanse. But the location of the antenna provided a critical starting point. Weeks of painstaking work passed with no results. The deep blue remained silent, and the investigators were starting to feel the weight of the years that had passed. The ocean had had 6 years to do its work, to bury, scatter, and obscure any trace of the crime. But the search team was relentless. They knew that if the boat had been deliberately sunk, there would be a concentrated area of debris, a telltale sign of a scuttling, and then a breakthrough, a sonar image, a faint but distinct anomaly on the ocean floor caught the attention of the lead technician. It was a shape that was not organic, not part of the natural seabed. It was large, and it had the distinctive angular lines of a human-made object. A submersible drone, equipped with high-definition cameras, was sent down for a closer look. The descent was slow and deliberate. The cameras transmitted a murky blue-green image back to the command center. As the drone got closer, the shape came into focus. It was the rusted, barnacle-encrusted hull of the Sea Witch. The catamaran, which had been designed to glide on the surface of the water, now rested in a tomb of sand and silence, its once sleek lines distorted by the crushing pressure of the deep. The discovery was a moment of profound gravity. The missing boat was no longer a ghost. It was a physical presence, a tangible piece of the puzzle. The emotional weight of the moment was not lost on the investigators. They were looking at a grave, a crime scene that had been hidden for years. But the discovery of the hull was not the final act. It was just the beginning. The Coast Guard's divers were deployed to the site. The conditions were treacherous. The water was deep, the currents were strong, and the visibility was poor. But the divers were professionals, and they knew the importance of their mission. They were not just recovering a boat. They were searching for the truth. As they began to explore the wreckage, they made a series of disturbing discoveries. The scuttling had been done with brutal efficiency. The seacocks, the valves that allowed water to be drained from the boat, had been forced open. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. In the cabin, in the silt and decay of a silent world, they found evidence that the Murphys had been on board when the boat went down. The items were small, personal, and profoundly sad. A photo album, its pages warped and faded, a pair of sunglasses, a book, its pages a pulpy mess. And then they found the bodies. The remains of Patrick and Virginia Murphy were found in the main cabin, their bodies still strapped into their life vests. The forensic analysis of the remains would later reveal the brutal truth. They had not drowned. Their lungs were free of water. They had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The impact had been sudden and violent, a single blow that had rendered them unconscious before the boat began to sink. The presence of the life vests was a particularly chilling detail. It suggested that the Murphys, in the final moments before their assault, were preparing for an emergency. Had they been alerted to a problem with the boat? Had they been trying to save themselves from a storm only to be struck down by a human hand? The evidence pointed to a scenario of unspeakable betrayal. The crime had not been a random act of violence. It was a premeditated, cold-blooded murder. The killer had led the Murphys to believe their boat was in danger, perhaps by tampering with a piece of equipment, and when they were distracted, he had struck. The discovery of the bodies and the forensic evidence from the autopsies was the final nail in the coffin of the lost-at-sea theory. It was the irrefutable proof of murder, and it transformed the investigation from a search for answers to a manhunt The case against Donald Murphy was no longer based on motive and circumstance. It was now supported by forensic evidence and a clear, horrific crime scene. The emotional toll on the Murphys' families was unimaginable. They had spent years grieving a disappearance. Now they had to face the reality of a murder and the fact that the killer was a member of their own family. The tragedy of the loss was compounded by the horror of the betrayal. The story had moved from a sad mystery to a full-blown tale of family betrayal and murder for hire. But there was one final piece of the puzzle to uncover. How had Donald Murphy, a man who by all accounts was not a sailor, managed to execute such a complex plot? He would have needed help, and the search for that accomplice would lead investigators down a dark path, a path that would reveal a shocking conspiracy and the existence of a killer who was not just an opportunist, but a professional, someone who could carry out a murder with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. The discovery of the bodies was a terrible and necessary step toward justice, and it set the stage for the final act of this somber, true crime drama. With the discovery of the Murphys' bodies and the forensic confirmation that they had been murdered, the case against Donald Murphy shifted from a theory to a solid, albeit circumstantial case for prosecution. However, investigators knew that a successful conviction required more than just motive and opportunity. They needed to connect Donald directly to the crime. The presence of blunt force trauma and the deliberate scuttling of the Sea Witch pointed to a professional, or at least a highly competent killer. Donald, by all accounts, was not this man. He was a passive individual, not a person known for violence or expertise in maritime sabotage. The logical conclusion was that he had not acted alone. He had hired someone to do his dirty work. The hunt for an accomplice began with a deep dive into Donald's financial records. While he was a man of modest means, a closer look at his bank accounts and credit card statements revealed a series of large, unexplained cash withdrawals in the weeks leading up to the Murphys' disappearance. The amounts were not exorbitant, not enough to raise red flags on their own, but when viewed through the lens of a murder investigation, they looked like payments for a service rendered. The investigators began to track the money, looking for any link between the withdrawals and an individual who had a connection to the sea. The search was a slow and meticulous process, sifting through a mountain of data. The break came from a single phone call. The call log showed a series of brief unlisted calls between Donald's home phone and a disposable cell phone in the weeks before the trip. The phone was a burner, its owner impossible to trace through conventional means, but the location data, which was stored by the cell tower, showed a pattern of movement that was anything but random. The phone had been active in the Murphys' marina in the area where the Sea Witch was docked in the days leading up to the disappearance. The investigators now had a solid lead. The calls connected Donald directly to an unknown accomplice. The next step was to identify the person behind the phone. They ran the numbers through a database of known associates, looking for anyone with a criminal record, especially a history of violence or maritime crimes. The search came back with a single name, James, a man with a history of minor felonies and a reputation as a professional fixer. He had a background in boat maintenance and had done work for several wealthy clients in the area. His name had never appeared in the initial investigation because he had no direct connection to the Murphys. He was an invisible hand, a ghost in the machine. James, who had been living a quiet life for the past 6 years, was now a primary suspect in a double homicide. The investigators moved in quickly. They brought him in for questioning, not as a suspect, but as a person of interest who might have information about the Murphys' boat. They were subtle, building a false narrative of a simple, non-criminal inquiry. The tactic worked. James, who had long assumed he had gotten away with a perfect crime, grew visibly nervous. He denied any knowledge of the Murphys or their boat. But the investigators had a powerful tool in their arsenal, a detailed account of the events from the moment the Sea Witch set sail, pieced together from the recovered wreckage and the autopsies. The investigators presented the evidence to James, showing him the pictures of the sunken catamaran, the life vests, the bodies. They explained in cold clinical detail how the murders had been carried out. They knew the details were accurate, and their authority was a powerful weapon. The emotional weight of the interrogation was designed to break the composure of a man who had been hiding a terrible secret for 6 years. And it did. The story that James began to confess was a horrifying and meticulous account of a cold-blooded murder plot. Donald, consumed by a cocktail of resentment and greed, had hired James to murder his brother and sister-in-law. The plan was simple and brutal. James, using his knowledge of boats, had sabotaged the Sea Witch's navigation system, leading the Murphys to believe they were in trouble and needed to change course. Once they were far out at sea, beyond the reach of other vessels and the Coast Guard's patrols, James, who had been following them in a separate boat, pulled alongside the Sea Witch. He used the pretense of offering assistance, a common courtesy among sailors. The Murphys, unsuspecting, welcomed him aboard. And in that moment of trust, the betrayal was complete. James had ambushed the couple, striking them with a blunt object, and then with their bodies secured in the cabin, he had opened the seacocks, scuttling the catamaran to make it look like a tragic accident. The money had been his payment, and the silence for 6 years was his reward. But the ocean, it seemed, had a different plan. The details of the confession were a chilling testament to the banality of evil. The crime was not driven by passion or rage, but by a simple, transactional need for money. The emotional weight of the story now shifted from a mystery to a profound sense of tragedy. The Murphys had not been lost to the vastness of the sea. They had been betrayed by the man they trusted most. The confession was the final piece of the puzzle, but it was a piece that brought no comfort, only a profound sense of loss and injustice. The case was now ready for trial. Donald and James were arrested, and the truth, hidden for so long, was finally revealed to the world. The story of the Murphys' disappearance, once a local legend, was now a grim cautionary tale of family betrayal and murder, and it all began with a single rusted piece of metal, a fragment of a lost world that had finally, after 6 long years, found its voice. The trials of Donald Murphy and James were a grim public spectacle. The once whispered mystery of the Murphys' disappearance was now laid bare in a courtroom, a narrative of betrayal and greed meticulously pieced together by prosecutors. The evidence, which had been silent for 6 long years in the depths of the Gulf, was now given a voice. The rusted antenna, the barnacle-encrusted hull of the Sea Witch, the forensic reports from the bodies, and finally, James's chilling confession, each piece was a nail in the coffin of the defense's argument. The emotional weight in the courtroom was palpable. The Murphys' families, who had suffered through years of ambiguous grief, now had to sit and listen to the horrific details of their loved one's final moments. The narrative of the events was presented in a chronological, step-by-step fashion, building a sense of dreadful inevitability. The prosecutor began with the serene image of the sea witch sailing out of the marina, a picture of a carefree life at sea. Then, the story took a dark turn. The prosecutor described the calculated treachery that was unfolding on land, Donald's financial woes, his rising resentment, and the series of large, unexplained cash withdrawals that marked the beginning of his dark conspiracy. The narrative was a slow, deliberate build, showing the audience not just what happened, but why. The prosecutor then introduced James, the cold, professional accomplice. The courtroom was shown the logs of the burner phone, the location pings, and the meticulous planning that went into the murder. The prosecutor's voice was calm, yet filled with a sense of gravity, as he described how James had stalked the Murphys, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The climax of the story was the recounting of the final moments on the Sea Witch. The prosecutor described the scene with an almost clinical detachment, using the forensic evidence from the autopsy to paint a grim picture. He described how the Murphys, thinking they were in trouble at sea, had put on their life vests, and in that moment of vulnerability, they were murdered. The description of the blunt force trauma, the lack of water in their lungs, and the silent, premeditated sinking of the catamaran was a punch to the gut. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the tragedy hanging in the air. The trial was not just a legal battle, it was a reckoning. The Murphys' families were finally able to see their loved one's story told, not as a mystery, but as a crime that had been solved. The verdict was swift and decisive. Both Donald Murphy and James were found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge's sentencing was a reflection of the profound tragedy of the crime. He spoke of the betrayal, the greed, and the chilling cold-bloodedness of the act. The two men, who had conspired to get away with the perfect crime, were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice, which had been so long delayed, had finally arrived. The case of the Sea Witch became a symbol of a different kind of justice. It was a testament to the power of forensic science, the tenacity of investigators, and the simple truth that the truth will always find a way to emerge. The ocean, which had been the silent accomplice in a double murder, had finally given up its secret. The story of the Murphys' disappearance, which began with a quiet boat trip and a mystery, ended with a terrible and necessary truth. The case was a reminder that even in the vast and silent depths of the sea, a crime cannot remain hidden forever. The rusted antenna, the first small piece of evidence, was a symbol of hope and a promise that the lost would one day be found. It was a reminder that even when all seems lost, there is a chance for justice. The story of the Murphys was a tragic one, but it was also a story of resolution, of a family finally able to bury their loved ones and begin the long, difficult process of healing. The ghost story of the Sea Witch was finally put to rest, replaced by a terrible but final chapter in a true crime story